It's a great opportunity to be here. Just like I start by acknowledging tangata whenua and mana whenua. Whakatakata hau ki te uru, whakatakata hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai, e he ake ana te atakura, he tio, he hoka, he hauahunga tihe Māori ora. And that whakatauki talks of greeting the new day, ceasing the winds from the east, the west, a spark of frost, recognition that something new is coming and that we're looking forward to the next stage. And I think that's really appropriate whakatauki for us in terms of our topic for today. Mental health at work, promoting well-being in the workplace. So just very briefly, so I'm the Chief Executive of the Mental Health Foundation of New Zealand. We're an independent charity, been around for 40 years. We were actually started with the proceeds of a telethon, if any of you are old enough and ugly enough like me to remember that. I can vaguely remember the song. We have a vision of a society where all people flourish, and if I'd written this a few days later, I would have put up, we've just got the figures. We had contacts, we had 6.6 million contacts with Kiwis in the last year. So we have a very big reach out into the community across kind of 5 areas of work: promoting positive mental health, working to create positive and supportive communities, working to prevent suicide, advocacy and commentary around services and policy, and providing commentary, information and advice to individuals and groups. In terms of thinking about mental health and well-being in the workplace, we set this in the context of kind of 3 streams or 3 areas of action, 3 pillars, if you will. Safe. Workplaces need to be intrinsically safe from a mental health and well-being perspective. They need to be supportive, so they need to be fair, empathetic, provide reasonable supports and accommodations to people when they're going through times of mental and emotional distress and tough times. But they also need to be strong. So they need to be actually promoting the connection, the resilience, the positive well-being within the culture of an organisation to build up that strength within an organisation. So remember, anything I talk about today in the context of those 3 key pillars or 3 key spheres of action: safety, support, strong. Behind all this, though, I guess is a fundamental question which we don't always ask, which is, what is mental health? And I'm going to ask you a trick question. Put your hand up if you had mental health in the last 12 months. Okay, yeah, I think you probably got it. Most people invariably think of mental health in the negative, and really taitoku language matters, and it's very easy for us to slip into talking about mental health meaning something negative. We wouldn't, even people who are our supporters, it's very easy to do, so I'm not beating people up. People who are our supporters and who, actively raise money for us. I saw a blog or a Facebook post the other day, guys raising money for us and saying, look, having had mental health last year, I really wanted to get behind, and what he meant was I had a time of mental and emotional difficulty. But we wouldn't say that about physical health. We wouldn't say I had physical health, meaning actually I was really unwell. And so there's a natural negative bias in our thinking around mental health. And we need to, as part of the destigmatisation, as part of the normalisation of the conversation, we need to start being a bit more precise about what we mean by mental health. So traditionally, I think, this has partly been driven by a very two-dimensional view of what mental health is. We've kind of got this single axis. At one end, there's mental distress or mental illness, this, horrible, scary thing that we don't like and we don't really understand. At the other end of that is just the lack of that, and we just don't want that. We we don't know what we do want, but we don't want that. Well, in actual practice, that's not very useful. It's not a very accurate description of people's real lives, and it's really not very useful for people like yourselves, and me, if we're trying to actually create a sense of mental health in the workplace. And so we're very informed by the kind of much more nuanced approaches that have been developing over the last 25 years, coming out of sort of the study really of happiness to a certain extent, and what creates happiness. And some of the work, particularly by the likes of Dr. Corey Keyes and many people that have followed on over the last 25 years. And so that adds another two dimensions really, which is the notion of languishing and the notion of flourishing. So flourishing is mostly that sense of feeling good and functioning well. So as your kind of default way of operating in the world, positive emotions, being quite goal-focused, engaged, both at work and in relationships and in other aspects of your life, a sense of resilience, able to bounce back from life's ups and downs. It doesn't mean the sun is shining and the flowers are always bright and nothing ever goes wrong, but it's that general sense of being engaged and of flourishing in your life and being able to cope with what life throws at you. By contrast, languishing has been described as a hollow and empty life, a sense of life having not much meaning, not having a strong sense of engagement, of having goals, of having purpose, that flowing through into commitment, behaviour in every sphere of a person's life, work, relationships, low self-esteem, and easily able to fall into a worse state of mental or emotional distress. Now, one of my colleagues said, gee, a real good way to describe this is, who would you rather work alongside? Someone who's operating primarily out of that flourishing space or out of that languishing space? Or if you're a manager, hell, who would you rather have in your teams? Would you rather have a team that's characterised by people that are flourishing or languishing? Who would you rather have as a colleague? So if we have that kind of more full, four-dimensional view of what mental health is, which really takes in concepts of well-being rather than purely illness, lack of illness, then what does New Zealand look like? Well, it's kind of roughly 25%, only about a quarter of us could be said to actually be flourishing, to be in that optimal space where we have the resilience, the supports, the mental and emotional habits, the engagement that really allows us to be operating in a state of well-being. Another 25%, doing not so bad, so it's not all terrible. But about 30% of Kiwis are operating in that languishing space, that space of not being engaged, not having a strong sense of purpose, very fragile, easily knocked off your perch, and that impacting throughout life. And then 20%, 1 in 5 people, will go through a serious period of mental and emotional distress every year. So that 1 in 5, and that number has been going up each time it's been measured in the last 20 years. If you're wondering where I got this information from, well, it actually comes from a range of data. Some of it comes from Ministry of Health data about incidents of mental and emotional distress. Some of it comes from New Zealand stats, where nearly half Kiwis had only 2 or less of the 4 key criteria for well-being operating well in their life. And then the yellow one's pretty interesting. That's the Sovereign Wellbeing Index, which was a specific attempt to measure the notions of flourishing and languishing within New Zealand. It was funded by Sovereign Insurance. They didn't like the term flourishing, so they chose awesome, I'm not sure whether that was a win, but that was what they chose. But again, across all these measures, very, very similar pattern. And so what that means is if you're looking at your average workplace, potentially this room, you know, this is, unless we've done something different, this is kind of the default pattern. So at any one point in time, up to 1 in 5 of your staff could be going through a significant time of mental or emotional distress. Another third really are kind of suboptimally operating in terms of their mental and emotional well-being. The other half doing okay, but only about a quarter doing really, really well. So that's the baseline. So if that is the baseline, you know, what do we do? And in fact, what are we even trying to do? What are we trying to achieve? You know, going from that traditional view of mental health as just that mental distress, mental illness, or the lack thereof, you know, a lot of focus has been put in medical science and treatments over the years towards trying to move people on that horizontal axis from mental distress to lack of mental distress. You know, and very much focused on individual treatment. Our view at the Mental Health Foundation is that this is actually the objective. It is to move as many people as possible into that flourishing space. It is perfectly possible to be living a flourishing life and still managing long-term mental distress or mental illness. And I know it's possible for at least one person because that's me, because I live with bipolar disorder. Was diagnosed about 20 years ago. As far as I know, you know, whatever that diagnosis means, but as far as I know, those symptoms are not going to go away. But through a combination of medication and lifestyle and social support that I've built into my life, I manage that bipolar and I have a flourishing life. Most of the time I'm really engaged. You know, this is my 4th or 5th CEO role and I'm a bloody good CEO, thank you very much. You'd be lucky to have me. You know, I'm a good parent. Look, I have a good life. Every now and then the symptoms of my bipolar, you know, rise up and I have periods of depression or anxiety or, you know, insomnia, and, you know, those are things I have to manage and live with. But that doesn't stop my core modus of living as being flourishing. So that is the objective, you know, and it is to encourage flourishing for all of us. For as many of us as possible. So how do we do that? Again, traditionally the focus has been on individual treatment, and look, that's very important. You know, like when I finally got on a good medication regime, I was like, yay, medication, you know. I take medication every day, probably will the rest of my life, and you know, I'm all for it, thank you very much. It made a huge difference to the symptoms of my bipolar and helped me get my life back under control. I've also used counselling and therapy, including EAP at different times of my life, and that's also been helpful. But, you know, and it's a key part of that whole supportive component of a, you know, A-grade, well-being focused, positive mental health engaged workplaces to provide that appropriate support to individuals. So it's an important part. You're only going to move people one at a time. And when we consider that, you know, if I took some of the other figures even further out, nearly 50% of all Kiwis will go through a time of mental or emotional distress that could be diagnosed as a mental illness during the course of their life. And in fact, some of the data that's coming out of longitudinal studies in Christchurch says that could be as high as 82%. So it's actually far more normal to go through a time of a significant mental or emotional challenge in your life than not to go through that. I mean, we wouldn't expect to live through life without getting the flu or a cold, So, you know, why should we be really surprised? And I guess my point about that is we're not going to change that one treatment at a time. But even more fundamentally, there are limitations to individual responses. So individual treatments won't affect the culture of the environment that people operate in, whether that's a workplace or a community or a society. And stigma, you know, is a huge component of what affects a person's mental health or well-being. So 1 in 3 Kiwi workers or Kiwis who've experienced mental health problems expect discrimination within their workplace. In Scotland, you know, nearly half wouldn't speak up about a mental health problem because they're scared they'd be fired. You know, I was at a seminar recently, and exactly the issue around EAP came up, where a number of people had anonymously put stories up on the wall, and there was one, a woman said, I was going through a really tough time with depression and anxiety. Finally got up the courage to go see the counsellor in EAP, but I was too embarrassed to tell the counsellor, so I lied and said it was something else. So, you know, stigma, internal stigma, is a huge issue. So individual treatment is not going to overcome that. You know, about a year ago, I had a bout of depression and anxiety, which was quite scary. I hadn't had a bad one for quite some time. And for me, the stigma that I'm always scared about is in a senior leadership role, I always kind of think, oh gosh, it'll undermine people's confidence in me. I have to appear to be strong, you know, I have to appear to be the strong leader. And, you know, eventually, you know, I work for the Mental Health Foundation. If you can't be up front there, you're pretty stuffed. So eventually, you know, but even there, that was the message that I was telling myself, and it took me about a week, and then eventually I told a few people, and then eventually I stood up in a staff meeting and said, hey, look, I'm actually not at my best at the moment, I'm going through a period of depression. And it was fantastic to be able to get that load off. Holding on to that secret was actually a huge deterrent to getting over that period of depression and anxiety. But I think it also really modelled that leadership, you know, that it's okay to talk about that. And it doesn't necessarily take away from your performance. But I think the other thing I really learnt was, even in the Mental Health Foundation, it was hard. So you have to make it so easy for people to be able to talk about mental health and well-being in the workplace. You have to make it a downhill run, you know, not just no barriers, no kinks in the carpet, because when you're feeling bad, you're depleted. Your personal resources are depleted, and the ability to actually overcome that and speak up is really difficult. It has to be very normalised. So we're not going to do that by only having an EAP scheme. And the way we treat each other has a significant impact on our well-being and mental health. And essentially, our mental health and well-being is not just an individual component. Yes, we are individuals, we have individual responsibilities, it impacts each individual differently, but the way we interact with one another, the way we treat each other, the norms, the cultures in which we operate have a very significant part to play in our mental health and well-being at a personal level and a collective level. So that brings me to the strong component of the 3 pillars: promoting positive health and positive well-being, positive mental health. And I stress that line underneath, mental health as an asset. It's very easy when we start talking about mental health and well-being within a health and safety context for the language to be all around risk and risk management. And that plays very strongly into mental health as a negative, mental health as something to be afraid of and avoid. But what about mental health as an asset? I mean, isn't your physical health an asset? You know, can you build your physical health, become more healthy, become stronger physically? Won't that play into benefits in every part of your life? Well, it's the same for your mental health and well-being, and it's the same for that at a collective level, at a work level. So, if you can do that at a cultural level within an organisation, you don't just move individuals, you can move the whole population curve of your staff. You can change that ratio of where people are operating. So, one of the tools that we promote as a very easy and accessible tool to use in the workplace is something known as the 5 ways to well-being. Now, this is often people go, oh, that's so intuitive, and it's not rocket science, but it is based on a huge amount of science. This came out of a study called the Foresight Inquiry in Britain, and it was a synthesis of 400 researchers around the world, and from psychology, neuroscience, performance science, education science, you name it. There was a boiling down of, a vast array of material to these 5 simple behaviours that you can incorporate into your personal life and incorporate into your collective team life. So connect. We're all hardwired to be social beings, and we need to put time and energy into connecting with other people. We need to have both people that we are close to, can confide in, can have empathy with, and we're actually hardwired to be sort of tribal animals. We need to have a sense of belonging to a wider group. Now, I'm sure many of you are aware the strengths that you get if staff feel that they belong and have a sense of connection to the wider group of a workplace, to the wider group of a team, to that sense of being together. Give. The bottom line is to give is to receive. There's a lot of neuroscience and psychology to back this up. It makes people feel that they have something to offer, it builds self-esteem, builds a sense of competence, and it helps to create connections. So it's not just about giving donations and giving time, giving money. It can be about giving of your time to other people. It's cultivating a sense of generosity and small acts of kindness. Now, if you actively cultivate that in a workplace environment, imagine what's that going to do for team culture as well as for people's individual well-being. What about volunteer days? What about the giving back to the community that the organisation does, and how that can be linked into the notion that this is good to do, and let's notice this is really good for our well-being. We feel good when we do this. Take notice. We have incredibly rushed and busy lives, and it's very easy to not take the time, even the moments, to actually be in the moment and notice little things that make us happy. There's lots of ways you can approach this. It's mindfulness and meditation, sort of exercises to slow us down, can be incredibly useful. I think of it as I try to never let a moment of beauty and happiness pass me by. And in New Zealand, connecting with our beautiful natural environment, is a very great way to do this. I mean, look at this. Right, your well-being will have just improved momentarily just by looking at that picture. That is science, that's not just me saying that. The science backs that up. Looking at a photograph of the natural environment for a few minutes gives you, your brain chemistry changes. So to spend time in nature, or to bring nature into your workplace and to notice it, actively cultivates good things in your mental and emotional well-being. Keep learning. And this again is not necessarily about, oh gosh, I've got to go do a master's or etc., etc. It's about we are hardwired to have inquisitive learning minds. So use it or lose it, guys. We need to actually cultivate that sense of inquisitiveness, of open-mindedness in our lives. So again, how can you do that in the workforce? How can we create opportunities for inquisitiveness, for learning, either formally within the workplace or informally. Book clubs, discussion groups, encouraging sharing of hobbies. There are a myriad of ways to do this. And then, of course, be active, the one that most people go to intuitively, but you don't have to be out there running, Oriental Parade every day. The evidence is that even an hour's light exercise across a 7-day period is a significant protector against depression and anxiety. We basically talk about move your mood. Move your mood. So 5 ways to well-being. I don't know how you people react to that. When I first saw it, I thought, of course. It's like, I wished that someone had showed me this when I was 15 or 16. If you're anything like my son, you probably wouldn't have listened. But I wish that I had kind of taken some of this stuff on board when I was 15 or 16. Because yes, when I got diagnosed and I got some medication and all those kinds of things, that was great. But there was very little attention paid to what can I do to manage my mental health and well-being, other than take my pills. And, this is empowering. Your mental health is a thing, just like your physical health is a thing. And you can do stuff to improve it. That's amazing. Well, it certainly is to me. And what's more, our mental health is a thing, and stuff we do together can improve our collective mental health and well-being. There are other models. The 5 ways to well-being is just a nice, easy one, but there are other models that capture the same idea. So, from Dr. Mason Jury and an Indigenous perspective to Whare Tapawha, picks up very similar sorts of concepts about a holistic approach to health and well-being and the connectedness that we need to have in order to build our well-being and build it together. What we find is that the 5 ways are really easy and approachable. So we work these into our kind of introductory modules for workplaces in terms of how do you get started. That whole thing, this stuff, there's lots of information about workplace well-being, but it can be daunting. So how do you get started? So our sort of equivalent to the Bell Guide, the Bell Canada Guide, is the Working Well Guide. And I know that we've also had some input into the state sector guide that's been developed. What we're doing is breaking our guide down into approachable modules that we're then offering to people online and through some train the trainer. And the first 2 was an introduction, creating positive environments, and then enhancing mental well-being, which was, okay, let's take the 5 ways. It's a real simple thing, and how would you use it? How would you actually get started? I won't go into great detail here, but if you look at the 5 ways to well-being, they're behaviours. They're all behaviours. They don't say, read this bit of information, understand it, and you'll be better. They say, do things. Interact with people, connect, give. Stop and notice something beautiful, something happy. Stop and notice your breath. Be active. And that's because behaviours change our emotional chemistry. I'm not a scientist, I'm not a doctor, so I'm not going to go any further than that. But if you look at those 4 key components of brain chemistry and look at the list of activities that help to stimulate them, you can see their behaviours. What we do and how we do things together actually changes our brain chemistry. So if you're wondering why, that's why. You don't need to know though, you just need to do it. But I think, one of the really important things from a workplace perspective is this notion that mental well-being is collaborative. We do it together, and that's really important for organisations, because what are organisations? The word organisation is really about formally doing things together. So, You know, social connection is part of well-being. That's something that can only happen together. How we treat each other affects mental well-being. Now, the culture, you know, issues of bullying, issues of stigma, or issues of generating random acts of kindness and giving and support and communication, you know, affect well-being. Behaviours affect our mental chemistry and our mental well-being, and behaviours are often done together, and individuals adopt behaviour because of what's going on around them. How many of you think you're wearing a cool outfit today? I do. It's getting a bit old, but I do. I think it's cool because I've seen other people wearing stuff like this and they looked cool. And I bet you that's why you bought your clothes too. You know, we are, whether we like it or not, we're influenced by peer pressure, by what other people do around us. So if we want positive behaviours, we create modelling, we create peer group modelling, we create workplace cultures that support this stuff. And we talk about it. Leadership is really, really important, you know. Good old Richie, and of course Ruby, you know, All Blacks and Black Ferns, world champions, they talk about this stuff. You know, the All Blacks talk about mental health and well-being. They talk about it very openly. And, you know, Richie McCaw said after the Second World Cup, the reason that they were world champions, because, you know, the Black Ferns were always world champions, so they didn't have to crow about this. They never lost, but the All Blacks had some coming back to do. So, you know, when he was talking about why they were second-time world champs, and he said it's the top 10 inches. They weren't fitter or faster or anything else than the other teams. They were more mentally resilient, and they'd worked consciously on that. And, you know, you'll see All Blacks championing this all over the Rugby New Zealand website, all over the Movember website. They model it. You can't delegate it and say, oh, HR, you go model this stuff. You need to be able to get up there and say, I'll pick on Ray, I'm Ray Smith, this is what I do in terms of exercising the 5 ways to wellbeing. This is how it makes me feel better. One of the things that we do is we promote Mental Health Awareness Week, and it's an opportunity for organisations, schools, whatever, to jump in and have a go at talking about mental health and well-being. And the great thing about talking about this positive stuff, the great thing about talking about things like the 5 ways to well-being or noticing nature, is it's a very safe way to talk about mental health. You know, people like to talk about what makes them feel good. So talk about that. Do stuff that makes people think about feel good, and then talk about, hey, did you notice that made us feel good? It made our mental health better. Our theme this year is let nature into your workplace. And there are so many ways that you can apply those 5 ways with a sort of nature lens. I mean, just getting out of the workplace and encouraging your staff to go out for a walk. Last year we did the workplace lockout where we had about 50 organisations around the country formally locked their staff out for an hour so that they had to go out into the natural environment. You put on, lunchtime sports, which is about being active, or just go for a walk. My staff go for a walk up Mount Eden once a week. Learn about some of our native plants, or learn something about our natural environment. We had a guy come in and talk to us about the maramataka, which is the traditional Maori lunar calendar and the Māori sense of seasons. Do some learning that's fun and interesting. Everybody get given a little pot plant and look after it, nurture it, give to that plant and learn what it needs to stay alive. And in doing that, you'll notice things about nature. There are a myriad of ways that you can bring nature into the workplace and notice, give to nature, bring in produce and share produce from people's gardens, or Go to a community clean-up, you know, in a park or a beach as a team activity. There are so many ways that you can bring nature into your workplace and get people to notice the impact that it has on their mental well-being. So give them the experience. We always say, have the experience first, because it's about behaviour and feeling a bit better. Then, oh, notice, yeah, that made me feel a bit better. And then you can start that conversation about strength, promoting positive mental health. What more of this can we do in the workplace? We've got a heap of resources that can support people. And I'm just going to give you a little bit more experience of feeling really good. Thank you very much.